Thank you, Akshay. Uh, Distinguished speakers, members of the audience, and my co-host Sanjay. Friends, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this August gathering, which coincidentally is being hosted in the month of August. Thanks to Lex Witness for organizing this fantastic conference on the theme of pharma, double H pharma, right? Uh, Friends, as you all are aware, the COVID-19 pandemic, apart from disrupting lives and livelihood, has caused a big dent into the very fabric of global business and industry in an unprecedented manner. Healthcare has borne the most direct impact of this crisis, and pharma, being an integral part of the healthcare ecosystem, now faces the challenge of playing its part in building more resilience and equitability into healthcare solutions. It is against this background that the pharma industry needs to address the sticky challenges of double-edged right in making sense of the legal, financial, regulatory, and quality assurance implications, whilst keeping in pace with the evolving demand for holistic drugs, formulations, and vaccines that can only come about through inorganic growth. Today's discussion is centered around the regulatory hurdles, whilst also touching upon other key aspects. Without much ado, I now turn to the sessions, and let's soak in the wisdom and insights of our esteemed speakers, all eminent professionals in their respective spheres. Let me first welcome Michael Prozoga, who joins us from Germany. He is currently the legal counsel of Ratio Pharma, part of the Teva Group. He has over 12 years of rich experience in international commercial legal affairs, including transactions, procurement, trade, and commercial matters, both from in-house in a global pharma company and reputable law firms. I am also pleased to welcome Meera Vanzhari, who is currently with Abbott as a legal director responsible for the pharma business. In her professional journey of 24 long years, she has had varied experience in different companies like Marico, Kodak, Johnson & Johnson, Bunge, and Glenmark, handling legal and compliance portfolios and leading legal teams. She was featured in GC Power List India 2016, published by Legal 500. She is a recipient of Outstanding Corporate Counsel Pharmaceutical Sector 2018 at a leadership summit held by Legal League. And most recently, she also featured in the list of top 100 General Counsel of India 2020 by Business World. Meera and Michael, you are most welcome on the conference. I also have with me Sanjay Kumar, who is a pharma counsel working with me in J. Sagar Associates. He has been working over 2 decades in life sciences and healthcare. He has extensive and rich experience in scientific, medical devices, and regulatory issues in product liability cases. He has expertise in also performing rigorous due diligences and drafting strong legal contracts for pharmaceuticals and medical device companies and their compliance functions, including clinical trials, price control, fixed dose combinations, US antitrust DOJ investigations, and CCI DG on drug cartelization of Indian pharmaceutical companies. Since friends, let me start with the Drug and Cosmetic Amendment Rules 2020 and the issues around that. Since 2014, besides the expanding scope for price control of notified drugs and devices like stents and orthopedic knee implants, we have seen bills proposing significant legal and regulatory changes, given the public pharmacies dispensing generics and the regulatory measures. India may soon become a generic-focused market, maybe. This makes drug quality paramount and critical to success. I would request our speakers to share their thoughts on the compliance challenges facing marketing companies and also their convincing resolution. Now, to begin with, I would request Meera and Sanjay to open the discussion on some of the recent important changes in the drug laws. Meera, may I request you to please start with the new marketeer definition, and also what are the implications of doorstep delivery on digital descriptions?
Sure. Thanks, Nitin, and thanks for inviting us to this platform today. It's a different conference because it's virtual. In the last 2 years, a lot has changed. So similarly, there has been a lot of regulatory changes also in the pharma industry that we've noticed in the last couple of years. And as you know, pharma is anyways a very regulated industry. Coming specifically to the marketeer's responsibility piece, right? This was something which industry tried very hard to push back, but eventually, the law got amended and we saw it coming into place. And it's now effective since the 1st of March 2020. So it's here to stay now. What we noticed is that in the pharma industry, the law recognizes loan licensing as a method of manufacturing products in which, let's say I as a company take on somebody's facility as on a loan license basis where I own the license is in my name. So the responsibility is entirely of the organization. But there has been a practice for many years in the pharma industry that people get into third-party manufacturing. And this is a very common concept elsewhere also in the world, but there was no recognition under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. And mainly as a marketeer, I would get the product manufactured from a third party, put his name as manufacturer, and I may or may not put my name as a marketeer. So basically, I was trying to absolve myself of any responsibility on quality and regulatory. And there have been lots of instances because if the Drugs and Cosmetics Act is a criminal prosecution, there is criminal prosecution under the act, and the person who has to face the music then has to be the manufacturer. But as a marketer, I'm also lending my brand name to the product, but I'm getting scot-free. So in order to pin down the marketeers, the law has been brought into force. So whereby I as a marketer today, I have to disclose my name on the pack. I have to have an agreement with the manufacturer, and I'm responsible for both regulatory and quality. Now, it's not clear what in quality and what in regulatory am I responsible for. It's a very vague, it's a very broad term, right? So now companies have started putting their heads together to see what is it that they can do to ring fence the risks that they face. Some of the things that industry has tried to do is, they've tried to make their quality systems more robust. You have more visibility, maybe more audits, a lot better documentation, and you yourselves are responsible to it. You kind of, you look at that product as it is your own product from your own facility. So you can't have a hands-off, attitude towards that product. So that's the biggest change. And legally, earlier I could take a defense in court saying that I'm the marketeer. I am not responsible for manufacturing. But today that legal defense is lost to me, and I can't contract out of it. Again, it's a matter of proving in court through evidence and all of that whether I was really responsible. But I think today my responsibility as a marketeer is that I need to take more responsibility of a manufacturer's facility as well. And I have to have more due diligence around it. So I'll stop here, and Sanjay, feel free to add, please.
Yeah, Sanjay, could you add what are the
the background? What Meera said that correctly, that farmers, this marketing company used to escape their liability by taking defense under Section 19 of the Drugs and Cosmetics Acts. But when the law was not enforced, still the courts used to make marketing company as a co-accused in any criminal case when the drugs was not of standard quality. And very particularly, it has been first time in Indian judiciary, it was observed in 2011, GSK versus State of Bihar, where Emcure was the manufacturer and GSK was the marketing company, and there was a violation of leveling violations, under which GSK filed for quashing of the criminal complaint filed by the drug inspector that GSK is not a manufacturer, that he should not be held liable and should be not be the part of the criminal proceedings. However, the Patna High Court dismissed this applications and observed that there is no concept of called principal to principal contract in the drugs laws. Under the drug laws, the drug law only recognizes loan and licensing. So, so this was the first time the Patna High Court dealt with this matter and concept of loan licensing and talked about what is principal to principal contract. The GSK also went into the appeal by filing SLP in the Supreme Court, but Supreme Court directly dismissed the SLP and directed back to the trial court. The matter is still pending in the trial court in Patna. So therefore, in order to make sure that the contractors, contract manufacturing should have a quality system and the marketing company makes sure that the products what comes out, it should meet the specifications. And this challenge and the risk can be mitigated by some of the suggestions what Meera has just said. I also would like to add one more suggestions, that just not relying upon the certificate of analysis what has been issued from the factory and to the warehouse of a marketing company. So marketing company should have some system in place to have a batch tested quality checks before it releases to the retailers and wholesalers, so that at least it can reduce the risk that there is a no substandard quality of medicine goes to the market.
Will it not increase cost, Meera?
Yes, it is definitely going to increase cost, and especially you have to ensure that there is more amount of due diligence, either quality, mainly quality, because that's going to be the key, right? Some companies may choose to have their own people, located at a manufacturing location to keep a better watch. There might be audits from time to time, more frequent audits. Yes, this will increase cost, and whether this cost will be passed on to the consumer is a matter that each company would decide. But yes, it will definitely.
Could you also, between the two of you, could you talk about what are the relaxations that the government has given during this COVID time?
Yes, Sanjay, maybe you can take that up.
See, the relaxations, what I see, the very important doorstep delivery notifications, which under Section 26B of the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, when the central government is empowered to pass an amendment in the interest of public and during pandemic. So it has allowed the retail pharmacists to deliver the drugs at doorsteps for patients. So this is a completely, this kind of digital prescriptions were never recognized under drug laws. This has been recognized for the first time. And however, there are some drugs which are under the dangerous drugs, which are Schedule H1, psychotropic substance, some antibiotics. They have not been allowed. And however, the Pharmacy Act very clearly says that only the licensed pharmacist can dispense the drugs to patient or its caretakers. So this is a welcome decisions, and this also supports during pandemic the e-pharmacy sites for the door delivery. And we have to see that how long this notification continues.
Sure. Meera, one of the most important changes that we have seen is the banning of the fixed dose combination. And could you speak about that, and what is the latest on that?
Yeah, sure. So, the FDC whole issue started somewhere in 2016, by an overnight notification where the government banned many drugs, right? And the whole industry got impacted. And it was a scene, it was truly, it was like a war. And we had so many pharma companies before Delhi High Court trying to get relief when the notification came in, and it became effective practically overnight. We've come a long way from there. As you know, a Nilima Shivsagar committee was then appointed to evaluate the rationality, safety, and efficacy of all of those medicine, all of those FDCs. And that was a very big list, 300 odd list of drugs that was identified. Many of them, at that point, the Supreme Court also passed in that case an order saying that, there were formulations which were pre-1988 formulations. When this was before the DCGI was even, the DCGI office was formed, right? So before that, you couldn't have got a DCGI certificate. So all the pre-1988 drugs, they were in fact given a exemption, saying that, they will be considered as, deemed to have a license, and they could, companies could continue marketing those. However, the Supreme Court did keep a window open there, saying that if the government felt, or the ministry felt, that they wanted to relook at these 19 or 20 odd drugs, they were free to kind of go back and investigate. After a lull of about a year or so, today, just recently, a week or 10 days back, we have seen that a notification has come out where they have identified 19 odd drugs, which are all 1988 FDCs. Now here, they have formed a new committee, and it's not under Dr. Nilima Shivsagar. And the committee is now going to freshly look into the evidence. And the evidence is primarily on 3 grounds: safety, efficacy, and rationality. And companies have been given time to submit the data.
Okay, great.
So, we will, most companies will now submit data. They will get an opportunity to appear before the committee. And the committee's recommendations will then go to DTAB, and then the DTAB will make its final recommendations to the Ministry of Health. What remains to be seen is that if companies are not able to establish the 3 parameters of efficacy, safety, and rationality, then you will again see a lot of litigation around these FDCs, because these are very age-old FDCs and they have been in the country for very long. It's just that you don't have a DCGI certificate for them at that, because they were pre-1988. So we will see this.
Great. Thanks, Meera. Sanjay, there's one more important amendment which has come in, is that all brand owners have been asked to give declaration on their brands. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, the DCGI notification has come in order to curb the practice of using the similar brands for having a different API, active ingredients.
Correct.
So that there is no confusion in the market, and there was an issue with the patient safety as well, because as a normal patient and consumers would not know that the brand is the same, but the contents have been changed, ingredients have been changed. So therefore, now the manufacturers are brand owners who wishes to apply for the proposed brand. They have to make a declaration, an undertaking under Form 51, under which they have to make a declaration that the particular brand has been searched from the internet and the registry, trademark registry, and this is not an infringing brand, or it's not used anywhere in India. And further, this has to make sure that earlier trademark authority and the drug authority has no connection, because they do not know that which brand is infringing or not infringing. And trademark authority doesn't know that this brand has been in a manufacturing or in use, or its constituent have been changed. So therefore, in order to make DTAB has made a recommendation to have some kind of a controls on the brand in respect of where it is creating confusion in the market for patient and consumers. So, and earlier also DCGI has issued one earlier notice in 2019 that brand having changed in the API content, they cannot use that brand.
I see.
So this is in order to curb the practice of having a same brand and using a multiple ingredients.
Yeah. So just to add to what Sanjay said, Nitin, see, it's a good move in terms of patient safety, but on ground, if you today try to get a trademark registered, because most of the trademarks are linked to their API name or the core ingredient name, right? The active. So it's very difficult to kind of get a name which is unique or different, And frankly, while the intent behind this is good, but today we don't have the mechanism and the infrastructure to link trademark to your drug approval process. That's not there. So, what is the value of that undertaking? And, it is my undertaking. I may think it is not infringing or it is not same or similar, but it truly, I don't know how much, what purpose it will serve truly in the industry. So,
I would like to add one more point. When I had a discussion with the regulators, so regulators told me that we don't want to go to the court in your trademark litigations. And therefore, we want to make sure that what is your undertaking is that your trademark is not infringing and all. So this was a statement passed by one of the regulators.
Sanjay, there is a Anuranjan Prasad, one of our audience, has asked a question here. And the question is to both of you, both Meera and you. It says, in case of loan and license arrangement, license for product is held by the marketing company. Hence, was it not always responsibility of the license holder to ensure quality of product? Any substandard product would make such license holder in violation. I guess so.
Yeah, so let me answer that. So, in a loan license, your name will appear on the pack as not the marketeer, but as the manufacturer. So it will say manufacturer, let's say Arihant Pharmaceutical, example, and the address will be of the owner of the manufacturing unit. So there, yes, you are liable, but your name does not appear as marketeer. It appears as the manufacturer.
Yes, correct.
Whereas now in a third-party manufacturing relationship, which is a principal-to-principal arrangement, your name appears as the marketeer and the name of the manufacturer who is actually manufacturing your drug will appear on the pack as the manufacturer. So that's the difference.
Okay, great. So we have a really fantastic audience as well today for our conference. So I would like to take a short poll here, and may I request the Lex Witness team to please initiate the poll. The question is, do you think India's reputation as the pharmacy of the world is correct? And are we as nation on the right track? No, I would like to conduct the poll immediately, and also let's see what the audience has to say on that. Despite Meera and Sanjay, several amendments, let's see whether the audience feels that India has become the pharmacy of the world. Yeah, so to the audience, this question has come on your screen. You could quickly submit your answers so we can see your answers. Even I can vote, so I'm voting now. Lex Witness team, how do we see the poll results? Are we done with the poll? Oh, wow. So we have result here. Absolutely. Yes, says 36%. Work in progress says 61%. Not bad, because I will always believe that any success or progress is always work in progress. So I think we can take this as a positive answer. Thanks a lot to the audience, and let's move on to the next point, next question. Now, the next issue I would like to touch upon is counterfeiting, an age-old problem. In the digital world of today, sale of counterfeit products is more than a menace. Is a big business worth of hoping 462 billion in a year, according to OECD and the EU's Intellectual Property Office. A 2017 report predicts that this hazard could touch an astonishing 2.3 trillion by 2022. Worst, few markets are so densely infested by counterfeits that the producers of genuine products are facing unbreakable entry barriers. This is very serious, Sanjay and Meera. What can be more tragic than this eventuality? So I would really request Sanjay to open on the counterfeit. What's your perspective on this? And then I will ask Meera to add upon whatever is left on that.
See, the counterfeit problem has been across the world. It's not that only India is having this problem. It's there in US, it's there in EU and Southeast Asia, across the world. So counterfeit problems is that where original manufacturer does not have a control on its quality and its locations where it is being sold. So therefore, counterfeit problem relates to the health and safety of the people. So in the counterfeit products, what happens? Generally, you will find that the product is not having appropriate ingredients, either less API, more API, or no API. Further, you will find that their expiry dates have been altered, or they are contaminated due to the wrong storage. So in order to address these problems, so companies should have anti-counter policy, anti-counter measures in place. And in India, we have seen recently that counterfeit vaccines were sold in Mumbai, where Mumbai police has formed SIT and it has raided, and its investigation is going on. Similar anti-COVID drugs raids happened in Orissa. So their special task force has arrested people and investigation is going on. Delhi police has also busted some manufacturing units recently in the month of May to April, June, where directors were also arrested along with the doctors for manufacturing fake medicines. And especially during COVID, people are forced to use the websites online sale of medicine. So where knowingly or unknowingly, people are becoming victims of fake drugs and they are buying it. So in addition to the trademark enforcement and FDA enforcement, we can look at some of the very important enforcement mechanism, which is by Interpol. So Interpol has taken a special task force for fake pharmaceutical products, and it has launched a couple of operations. The recent one is Pangea 14, which happened in May, around 1 week, last week of the May, where more than 30 million drugs were seized, more than 100,000 websites were, and links were shut down. 223 arrests were made. It was the raid done along with the 93 countries' cooperations and FDA officials, along with the police authorities. Similar operations happened in 2018 in the Asia Pacific regions, where Myanmar, Pakistan, Bangladesh, couple of countries were involved. Similar operations happened in the MENA region, where Egypt, United Arab Emirates, North African countries were involved. So these all shows that we can do this, provided we have a will to do that. Interpol does not entertain the direct complaint from the individual and public. It always says that you contact your local police, and from the local police, they can take it forward. However, they have a special provision for private companies. Private companies can make them, they can become a partner to Interpol. So this is the thing I wanted to share with you. And having a policy, zero tolerance policy for any fake drug, any fake websites, those who are selling illicit drugs. And this can be tracked down with the help of, there are tools available in the market, which shows you that these are the illegal websites. You can complain to the Googles and those search engines. They have a policy to shut down those websites. You can also have a monitor and watch on the merchant side, Visa, for example, MasterCards. They have information from where this transactions are taking place. They can also take some actions. So these are my thoughts about the encountering anti-counterfeit.
Thank you, Sanjay. Before I really invite Meera, we have an audience, Bipla, who has very interestingly added some fantastic observation. He says some of the pharma and nutraceutical companies have initiated the process where consumer can identify if the product is original or not by scanning the product and verifying it with a code. Now, though this is a bit technical, in the coming days, he says that the process can be improved. And right now, this is really helpful for the ones who are tech savvy and good with smartphones. I guess these are, there will be not lot of new technology inbuilt measures will be inserted by companies to protect the for the counterfeiting. Meera, your views on that?
Yeah, so he's right. I mean, it's the QR code is something that is the government is planning to implement. This is like a track and trace mechanism, and this was, this has been in the offing for the past couple of years, and especially so for products that are being exported, because many of the pharma products which are manufactured outside of India have certain, tracking and tracing mechanism, which also means a barcode that you can scan. Many companies in India are also in the process of implementing this, and this will help you trace the authenticity of that product. It will help the company know where the product is going. And also, it also gives the reader a quick view of what that product is, the dosage, what it is meant for, and is it a prescription drug, is it a over-the-counter drug, and so on and so forth. So it's a very good move, but again, that is going to increase cost because you have to have the backend ready for it, and you have to have, all the IT technology to support it.
Absolutely.
Second question of Biplab, about counterfeit. I think the biggest challenge we face in our country is about, it's the FDA who is empowered to take action on counterfeiters, right? Or on spurious drugs. So there is a dearth of a concentrated, team, or maybe a concentrated resource pool in the FDA, which can look after these issues on an immediate and urgent basis. Many times what happens is we identify source of counterfeit by the time we go to the police machinery or to the FDA authorities. A lot of time is lost, and the time lag, these people who are the counterfeiters, who are basically they're, fly-by-night operators, they disappear, they vanish, and they again resurface after some years, or some months. So the whole issue is that, like, for example, if the example that Sanjay gave of Interpol, right, there is a concentrated effort by a dedicated number of people to, go after this and get to the bottom of it, which is lacking in our country, because, our police force is also so stretched that at such times they're not going to, go behind, counterfeit incidences. And we have seen a big increase in this in the COVID times. And many of these, now the online platforms and e-pharmacies have become an easy mechanism for counterfeiters to put their products on sale. And the issue that we face there is that, the e-pharmacy says that they are only a platform provider. So they are only giving you a platform where they can have a seller and a buyer being bought together, and they will not really vouch for the authenticity or the quality of the product. And as far as they can go is, you can complain to them. They have a complaint mechanism. Many times we found that when we go and investigate the address that is given to us, it's a sham address. It's not the address of the real counterfeiter. And neither can the e-pharmacy platform do anything. At the most, they just bar him, or they will blacklist him. So it's not helping us get to the bottom or the root of the issue. And here something definitely needs to be done, where both the e-pharmacy and maybe the company whose brand is being impacted needs to come together, and something needs to be done in this area.
I guess you both will agree with me that the laws are quite sufficient. Even the challenge really lies in the enforcement. And because the courts take time, because the
machinery is very stretched.
Very stretched. So I guess that's the problem. Otherwise, law, if you ask me, on counterfeiting, I think that's quite sufficient. I don't think so. We need any still better laws from that. Thank you, Sanjay and Meera, on this. Now, let me invite my friend Michael from Germany. He has been patiently waiting for some time now. Michael, thank you for your time. So let me move to the question of licensing scenarios in international pharma. See, licensing is a most critical aspect of the pharma industry, if I may say. Now, licensing of novel molecules and technologies through a new phenomena though is a new phenomena for Indian pharma, has now assumed monumental importance in this specific context of new product strategies of pharma organizations with aggressive growth plans across the globe. A lot of pharma companies Indian pharma have really expanded to the global market. So may I ask our Michael to share his insightful experience on the drug in licensing and out licensing, whether in the context of a product or a process patent, use of trademark or a brand name or product process know-how, supply of APIs, semi-finished or finished formulations, or any generic market. Over to you, Michael. I guess you would like to make a presentation. So if you want, you can share your screen, and we'll be all eager to listen to you.
Thank you, guys, for having me today. I just wanted maybe to add some comment on the previous topic. I think that's the really huge problem, not because the pharma company is losing money, but people are dying, right? So I think it's not only up to regulatory authorities to do something. It's also the pharma companies can do more, because they are in control of the process. It's starting from serialization, for example, and ending with the integrity of their supply chain, right? They know to whom they sell, and they need to make sure that they sell, and they know where the product is going. So obviously, it's always, we have faced this. The regulation is not perfect, so we always have this kind of parallel trade regulations. So to what extent you basically can control your product and where it goes. So it's definitely, it should be kind of balance should be found, but it's not only about somebody to do the work. We should do by ourselves also some more efforts on this topic. So getting back to the in-licensing. So I'm going to share a presentation. Let me know where You see, yeah, sure. Right, that's, you see it, correct? Yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I believe it's you know, not a secret that these days it's kind of challenging for pharma companies to work unless you manufacture vaccine, right? And then maybe you're in a good shape. But you know, the patients do not go enough to doctors, and the hospitals delayed in the regular treatments, so they obviously do not buy enough products. So there is some kind of limitation, but on the other hand, we still need to grow, right? Companies need new products, patients need new products. So how do we do it, right? So the simple answer is in and out licensing, right? So you see the image. That's how I see our you know, framework when we come to the licensing. So we have limited resources, but we need to do a deal and to have a product. So basically the main goal is to bring the good product and close deal quickly. And challenges, as you can see, many of them, right? Budgets, uncertainty on the markets, and we obviously need to follow up with the working, you know, existing procedures of the companies. And if it's big company, it's more challenging to fit everything in the current structure. So now, you know, go in and close the deal. So my view, and basically our view in our company, how we should do it, and I'm really kind of, you can read, but I can go quickly. It's to make process more simple and looking for, you know, going forward without any kind of unnecessary burden. So first of all, parties need to understand what is it about, right? So they need to have main understanding of the deal, of the product. So it is very advisable to have all audits, whether it's IP or dossier, before you sign the deal, and not after, and then you are surprised and you have problems, right? Yeah, various forms of economics. So it's really kind of challenging these days to find the right balance between, you know, the risks and the benefits. So you need to be creative in this way, and to make sure that all parties are basically satisfied with the deal. And also the way we see the deals, both parties need to be flexible and focus on only things that really must have, and not only as a previously, yeah, it's nice to have, let's negotiate for the next 6 months agreements, right? So that's kind of focus, but then it should be from both parties, not only from one party. Also important to be open with the partners, right? To clearly express what are the limitations, and then to have this you know, trust that something which cannot be done, it's really cannot be done, not because you don't want to do it, and that's kind of very important part of the relationship, either before you enter into the deal or after. Also very important, and it's really to have balanced templates, because I see more and more, maybe because it's the challenging times for the companies, but they come with kind of templates which they think it's balanced, but it's complete, you know, draconic and unbalanced. So you cannot work, and you spend a lot of time on negotiating this, and it's I believe it's waste of time, and we all know what is the standards of the in our industry, right? So we do not need to invent anything new. Basically, we can just stick to what is the common practice and best practices, and move forward to have this deal closed quickly. An additional tool that we basically use, it's Playbook, which provides both business and legal some kind of pre-alignment on certain points where we can be flexible, or like a fallback position, when we do not need to go and gather each and every change multiple approvals and consent from different departments. So from very beginning, you already have this framework when you can say, okay, I can accept it and move forward. So it's very useful, and it's live document which you already update every time, and then it's really kind of useful, and including, for example, escalation roads for some specific questions when you know to whom you need to approach to, right? It's not like you whom I asking for this and this and that. So you already pre-approved framework. And also, I think maybe most important part is as inside in-house counsel. I believe the contract is not for the lawyers; they are for the business and for the operational guys. So yes, definitely we are involved, and we need to make sure that whatever they want is really correctly expressed. But they need to know what is written there, and they need to go through it. Otherwise, it will not work. So yeah, so that's very briefly. I try to keep it short, and happy to answer any question if you have.
Just one question, Michael, from my side. Now, when we're looking at in-licensing or out-licensing, does it really do you see uniform documentation across the globe? Because now business is being conducted by most of the companies on a global platform. So do you see the documentation particularly, or the process that companies are following, are they becoming more and more uniform?
Unfortunately not. It's still, as I said, there are kind of customary arrangements, right? That we have but in terms of wording, unfortunately, yeah. For example, we in Teva, we try to use a template with the same suppliers to use the previous deals, or the same template, for example. So we at least do not need to invent each time the deal from scratch. So it already gives some kind of framework for specific. But yeah, it would be good to have something unified, and then we just have an annex with the product and sign. It would be perfect. But yeah, unfortunately, it's also problem when, for example, people are moving from company to company. They BD people, for example, or legal guys, they come and say, "Hey, I make revolution now. I will invent everything." And that's how some we try to avoid also, either internally in our company or externally. So we try to say, guys, we have this relationship. Let's keep the framework. Why no need revolution? Everything is good.
So let me ask one question to Meera on this, and let me see whether she's answering honestly on this or not. My question, Meera, is that what if the business people tells you that, look, we want this agreement we want this particular clauses, and when you feel as a council, these are really not enforceable, or these are not in line with your thought process as a legal counsel, what do we do? Who wins at the end of the day?
So this happens all the time, and it's a very relevant question. I think business always wants to get the deal done at any cost, right?
Correct.
And as a gatekeeper for the organization has to balance business and the legal protection that it needs to give to the organization. Yes, so some clauses where there is a commercial risk, we explain to them what could be the risk, is there a way to mitigate it, and what it could expose the organization to. But if it's a truly commercial call, then commercial is free to take that call. But if it is anything to do with legal, let's say an indemnity clause or a representation clause, or any other termination clauses, then the decision lies with legal, because it could have long-lasting implications on the organization. And to Michael's point on in-licensing and out-licensing, it's very important for both the parties to understand that it has to be a win-win for both, because if you delay the process, you are losing the opportunity in the market, and that can be taken by somebody else, unless, of course, if it's an exclusive molecule or exclusive drug. So in the generic industry, at least, you will have many generic players trying to vie for one deal. So it's very important to be able to, cut the time, focus on really what matters, and then move the contract forward.
Let me, Meera, take that very same question to Michael. Michael, internationally, what do you really put your foot down as a council, saying that no, this the business people cannot do this?
First of all, yeah, it's very simple when it's something which looks like unenforceable or illegal. I will not use this word illegal, but something which is as Mira said, it's more simple. So it's not really black and white. You have other things which you think, business people come and most of them, they just want to close the deal and move forward. But you want to have you have the prospect for next years, and that when we did it last time, they come to you and ask what they should do, how exactly they need to look into this paper and this arrangement. So you need to make sure that as a legal counsel, which is not business person, you understand what does it mean exactly and how it will work in the future. And that's, you need to take them, because they are, I'm not saying floppy, but they want, okay, so we agree on everything, we understand, we have common understanding, and then we'll say, okay, let's write this down. And then you see it's not exactly in the way it was, even commercial agreement. I'm not talking about legal stuff, right? So yeah, it's challenging, but that's the job. And if we need external counsels to confirm any concerns, so we go to external counsels, and then business can, okay, they come down and accept, because that's how it's not only we as an in-house counsel say something, it's all, even law firm said, so that's it. That's done. So it's,
you put the ball in the law firm's court.
Yes, it's sometimes it needed. Yeah, it's yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Michael, so much for your insight on the lien licensing arrangements. Now, I have a very interesting comment from my friend Arvind Sonawane from Thermo Fisher on the previous question of counterfeit. He says, in case of a criminal prosecution by the company, I think he's suggesting that companies should initiate criminal prosecution with the police, or initiate through magistrate. And the approach is to create awareness rather than actually go to a trial, and this way is saying new criminals come up and this goes on. So this is also due to the fact that in India, which trials take a lot of time. So essentially, Arvind is suggesting that to avoid or to fight the counterfeit issue, you must be prompt to initiate criminal prosecution, because that also acts as a deterrent. The idea is not really, even if the trial takes time, doesn't matter, but the fact that you are initiating criminal prosecution, it also acts as a deterrent, and it works well against other people, I guess. Thank you, Arvind, for your comment on this. So guys, again, time for poll. So may I request the Lex Witness team to initiate the poll. So the second question is, do you think global pharma will be able to reverse the pandemic effect with smart inorganic growth in, say, a couple of years' time? The question, do you think global pharma will be able to reverse the pandemic effect with smart inorganic growth in, say, a couple of years' time? Well, we have almost majority, 70% saying yes, global pharma will be able to reverse the pandemic effect. But yeah, there is a small percentage of people who says no, absolutely not. Oh my God, so are we going to continue with the pandemic or what? And 32% says maybe. People are not sure. Okay, great. I'm happy that at least 62% people are saying that yes, global pharma companies will be able to reverse the pandemic effect with smart inorganic growth in couple of years' time. By couple of years, I guess just it will be a question of couple of months. Let's not be pessimistic about it. Our pharma companies have done a great job, I would think. With the pandemic, in 8-9 months, they came out with the vaccination. So I don't think so why we should have reason to doubt their capabilities. Okay, let me move to the next topic of e-pharma, a blind eye ahead. And I would again come back to Meera and Sanjay for this. Sanjay, the total addressable market or potential for Indian e-pharmacies is expected to be $18.1 billion by 2023, from 9.3 billion in 2019. now presenting a huge market opportunity according to the ENY report. Now, with no specific statutory regulations in vogue, will this growth remain largely unregulated? See, that's the key question, because e-pharma is really, really growing right, left, center in all directions now. Therefore, I would request you to Sanjay to dwell upon the critical issues surrounding the prevalent laws under the Drug and Cosmetic Act with regard to e-pharma. And I'll request also Mira to supplement if she has any a point in addition to that.
Thank you, Nitin. As you know, the deals have been declared, and you know that Tata 1mg, Reliance, so the huge number of multinationals are also, selling the drugs online, including Amazon. And the question is that under what law they are selling the products. And if you see, the Drugs and Cosmetics Act does not recognize online sale of the drugs so far. And Drugs and Cosmetics Act Chapter 4 very clearly says whosoever sells, store, exhibit for sale must have a license. And in case there is no license, there is a violation of Chapter 4, which should be punished accordingly. So in case of e-pharmacy model, what we see here, so they are operating as a third party intermediary under which is recognized under the Indian IT Act 2011, and as per the intermediary, they are providing the sites for third party sellers, under which third party sellers are posting their products. Now question is that whether this immunity given as an intermediary under the IT Act, so is it available at all the times to e-commerce companies? So no, unless the e-commerce company has complied certain compliance, as we have seen in the case of Snapdeal case by the Karnataka High Court recently, under which Karnataka High Court has observed that as an online company, you must have a compliance in place, due diligence in place, have a user agreement in place, privacy policy, and make sure that banned products are not listed, and you take the timely actions. So further, we look at this controversy regarding the whether it is legal or illegal. We have a DCGI notice, an order which clearly says that online sale of the drug is prohibited and the state drug authority should take action. This notice has not been still nullified. And further, we have two high courts judgment which are contradictory judgments. Karnataka High Court in a single bench banned the online sale. Sorry, Madras High Court banned the sale of medicine on online. When it was appealed to the division bench, so division bench allowed to the sale of drug, online sale of the drug, and they asked the government to implement the e-pharmacy rule at the earliest. However, the Delhi High Court has given a stay on the online sale, which is still continuing. So another question is that if online seller, this e-pharmacy, so they are which jurisdictions they should sell the product so that they are not prosecuted. So another compliance part, what we can look at in a general compliance when you are selling the products. So you need to have a license to sell. You need to have a cash memo. You need to display the license at the conspicuous places. You should not sell the banned products. You should follow the MRP as declared by the DPCO. So the law is not very clear. We are expecting e-pharmacy bills, which needs to be notified, which recognizes the e-pharmacy, so that e-pharmacy can run within the legal framework.
Meera, you want to add?
Yeah, so what's rightly put by Sanjay, I think e-pharmacy is here to stay. We all have had the benefit of ordering medicines online during COVID, and now it's become a part of our life, right? It's the way going forward. Yes, the law is not very clear. There have been two contradictory judgments, one of the Delhi High Court, one of the Madras High Court. And there has also been a notification by the DCGI's office or to all the state FDA authorities asking them to stop online, but it hasn't stopped. And recently the doorstep delivery notification itself came out, which also permitted retailers to provide delivery of medications at home, right? So there is a lot happening around this space. I think what is important to understand is how do we have certain responsibilities put on the e-pharmacy owners or the platform owners, because you can't say that I'm just an intermediate and take the immunity under the Information Technology Act, that what happened in the Snapdeal case. So it's very important to have some ownership and responsibility cast on them as well. Because you're talking about medicines which could impact lives, which could have very adverse events on patient safety at the end of the day. So I think we have to, the government has to think through all of these issues and have a holistic law or rules which will address these kind of things, these concerns that we are now seeing. Again, jurisdiction becomes a big issue, right? If I'm selling a medicine in one state and you're receiving it in another state, where do I, if it's a spurious drug or any other issue that I have, where do I go and file a court case against you? Where do I go? And so all of that is very, very unclear at this point in time.
We have a very interesting question from Jasmeet Arora about the pricing of vaccination. Now, I guess that question is a legal and plus political. So we should restrict ourselves to the legal answer. Sanjay, here is the question. Question to the panelists: how challenging is it for the pharma companies to maintain a stable pricing and policy environment? Example, we could all see the vaccination prices being changed every now and then. What are the factors driving these changes? Meera, Sanjay, you want to address this?
So okay, go ahead, Sanjay.
Yep. So the vaccines development, what we see is the rapid development which has happened with a lot of public fund and as a private fund. And since this vaccine technology has been licensed, if you see in the most of the cases, so the licensor is under the control of the price, and government is just negotiating the price with this licensors. And since the demand is huge, supply is less, production is less, so therefore this is still not has come under the price control. But the company policy has a different policy. Some of the companies are selling at the $4 per dose, like AstraZeneca, and some of the companies are selling around $40-50 per dose. So that's quite different from the legal perspectives. So government has not putting any pressure or say on the companies for the time being, so that the vaccine supply and production should not be impacted.
Meera, you want to add?
So I would like to answer this, in terms of how regulated the pharma industry is becoming, right? Not just vaccines. If you see, a lot of the drugs are coming under the price control regime. So as you also know now, the new NLEM list is soon going to be announced by NPPA. And that is also going to bring a lot more of the drugs which are essential, which are, which they think are essential medicines, will be under price control. Also, during the pandemic, you would have seen that masks and sanitizers, initially when they were launched, there was no price control on them, but the government did introduce a price control. So I think it's only a matter of time. But given the current scene on vaccines and there is so much of controversy around it, I think the government has refrained from pricing it now, but it's just a matter of time in my view.
Great, thank you, Sanjay and Meera. So we have, I must also thanks Lokesh Jain, who is the chairman of the Chandigarh PhD Chamber of Commerce. He's complimented the sessions. He's complimented all the speakers. He says that very meaningful sessions on pharma. Thank you, Michael and Sanjay and Meera. So thank you, Lokesh, for your appreciative words. Now, friends, again, let's move to one more poll. I would like to take another poll before we really move on to the M&A part. And the poll is: what is the reckoning is the greatest bottleneck for pharma players? diverse and ever evolving safety guidelines and regulations, or lack of integration across inventory, manufacturing, labeling, or hard hurdles to rapid drug discovery and shortage of raw material?
So maybe meanwhile, I'm just add comment on the e-commerce.
Sure.
Sure.
I believe it's not a new trend, right? It was beforehand. It's not something, but I believe now it's become like not just nice to have activity. It's must activity for each and every pharma company which I know. But the issue is really with regulation, which kind of has no clue how to deal with this new creature, right? So there is something, but it's not really developed, and so I think that we will see more and more these activities to be done, but it's really kind of need to be done based on careful but really pragmatic risk assessment, and it's connected to your previous question, right? How quickly a pharma company will recover. So it's really, these days, it's one of the important ways to extend the sales and awareness of the brands. So yeah, it's
great. Thank you, Michael. So we have, almost 61% people, overwhelming majority people are saying diverse and ever evolving safety guidelines are really the greatest bottleneck for pharma players in India. 14% are saying lack of integration, and 25% are saying hurdles to rapid drug discovery and shortages. Great. So from there, friends, let me move to the M&A part. M&A, a strong growth strategy. So it is. Let me introduce myself. A very short introduction. I am a M&A lawyer. Practicing for last over 3 decades now, a partner of J. Sagar Associates. My primary practice has been foreign investment that comes in India and advising companies on M&A, hardcore M&A, and structuring their deals. Now, speaking on the M&A as a growth strategy in pharma, I would say it is heartening, friends, to know that global deal activity has held up reasonably well despite an ongoing climate of economic uncertainty. In fact, I would say pharma and IT, these are the 2 industries, and the consumers, these are 3 industries which have really done well. And I'm seeing a lot of M&A activity in the pharma space and IT space. Many businesses have maintained that M&A continues to be the integral part of their growth strategy. Having said that, transactions are taking longer to conclude, which could adversely affect the deal's overall contribution to the growth. Successful leaders are therefore spending more time, I'm seeing time and attention on insulating their businesses against potential risk and obstacles through prudent M&As of scrupulous negotiations and valuation processes, deal financing, and cultural integration of the merging organizations. I would like to invite even Meera to contribute on this subject along with me. Speaking for myself, and because I'm talking to the audience who are more general counsel, I would think I would think that it is high time that the general counsels really play a very, very important and significant role in not only just implementation of an M&A strategy or deals for the companies, but they start. I guess this time has come where you start participating in structuring any M&A deal. I would expect the general counsels to play very, very meaningful and a core role in actually structuring the deal. That's very, very important to my mind. Now, this would happen, friends, only and only if the general counsel understands not only the regulatory part, but the general counsel. There's time that we legal counsels should understand business models. We need to understand technology, particularly because it is no more now. Technology is no more just the enabler of a business or enabler of an M&A. Technology is becoming business. Earlier technology was considered as to play a supportive role. Now I am seeing technology is getting completely integrated into the business. So technology is becoming a business. So I would think the role of a general counsel is much, much more serious now. We need to understand business models, we need to understand technology, and we also need to understand the financial implications. M&A, when we talk of M&A across the globe now, there's not too much of time to really dwell upon the whole set of M&A. M&A comprises of a court mergers, either a court scheme or out of the court scheme, and primarily the M&A that happens in pharma are majority of acquiring brands, acquiring licensing rights, acquiring distribution networks, or the global reorganization that happens in terms of the product portfolios of companies. So pharma, I would say, given the pandemic, there are a couple of things which would happen, and these are very important for pharma companies. I would think M&A or joint ventures are very strategic, and hence there could be, because of the pandemic, because of stoppage of, because of the pandemic current situation, there could be risk of misalignment of the core objectives. Because everyone is finding difficult in many companies are finding difficult situation. Many companies are finding opportunities. Some companies are finding opportunities across the geography. Some companies are finding opportunities in the products. So there could be misalignment of core objectives. So I think as a general counsel, you must understand what really was the core objective, or what is the core objective of the company. Now, pandemic is second important point is pandemic is straining the ability of the boards to maintain governance, or also of the management to maintain the agreed contractual obligations. Now you would have to anticipate those for the legal structure. You really need to understand where the things could go wrong, where we could we may not be, where your company may not be able to honor the contractual obligations, or where there could be a constraint on the governance. And that you need to not only anticipate, but you need to take the management into confidence and explain them the position and come up with an amicable, or come up with a viable solution. That's very critical, and it is only the general counsels can do, and no other person will really understand or appreciate this constraints of the management. Now, even I am seeing in many cases experienced managers, senior managers often disregard the best practices. Those are very serious issues, the serious questions, or they may ask you to skip steps which may impact the contractual obligations. Now, these are the time that's where I would think, whenever you structure, or whenever you think of already the M&As that you must have structured, or you must have already conceived and completed just before the pandemic, it's high time that you go back to the drawing board, or you go back to your desk, find out the contractual obligations that you already undertaken. Whatever are the pending obligations? Are there any constraints on your management to comply with those? Third issue could be liquidity, or loss of revenue could pose bigger challenge than what is anticipated. So again, that is more of a challenge for the financial managers of the company, but ultimately it will boil down to the obligations that you have undertaken vis-a-vis the management companies. That's another aspect which you need to take care of. The fourth point I would like to mention about M&A is speed can make a big difference in cutting edge industries. But it is important as a general counsel to be very methodical at every stage of the deal making process. We heard people saying that, look, time is of essence. We need to complete the deal. We need to conclude the deal. We can't stay out of the market. Its time is of absolute essence. That may be so, but that doesn't mean that you need to skip any step in the deal making process. You need to be very, very methodical, and you need to anticipate issues, and you need to anticipate problems, risk metrics. The simplest process that I would always recommend for general counsels, in-house general counsels, to do any M&A, whether it is a sale, acquisition, or even taking investment from strategic investors, or entering into technology licensing agreement. I would think the simplest process that I always recommend GCs is that make two notes. One is a commercial note. Identify what exactly are you trying to achieve commercially, in terms of financial or in terms of other obligations. That is, the business obligations need to be identified. A. Second part is what are the regulatory issues, and what are the time frame, or what are the compliances that you need to do. If you have both the list in front of you, the business issues, business risk, and business advantages and disadvantages, or what you are trying to achieve, and the regulatory risk issues and the risks of whatever associated, with this two comparative list, you will be probably in a position to address the issues correctly, take the management into confidence, and address them in a very systematically and scientific way. Now, again, friends, as I said, M&A is has been in the last 100 years. M&A and joint ventures are the best growth strategies, and I am seeing a lot of companies, whether it is pharma, healthcare, life sciences, medical equipments, e-commerce, everyone is trying to do some kind of innovative deals. So it is not just innovative drug delivery or drug products, but I'm also seeing a lot of innovations in the deal making process. Now, why we are seeing innovation in the deal making process? Because of, as I said, two things, two critical things. One is the technology is playing a very great important role, and secondly, geography. I am seeing a lot of Indian pharma companies want to really go abroad. I am seeing a lot of international companies want to come and play a role in India, because India is a large market. No one can ignore India as a market. So I am seeing both ways, and as we have seen, India is really the pharmacy of the world. We are supplying vaccines to almost 180 countries globally. Not just vaccines, but we are the supplier of a lot of APIs and generic to the global market. So I am seeing, I could see in the next 10 years, all the pharma companies that we are seeing, whether it's a small scale, mid-size or big companies, they would undergo a lot of change. And one great thing I am seeing is that a lot of Indian large pharma companies are investing heavily into R&D. So you could see a lot of new products coming out of India from the large Indian companies. And these not only poses opportunities for new M&A or growth strategy, but this would really make the role of a general counsel in a pharma company much more robust, much more meaningful. And to really to take it to the next level, I would earnestly suggest that as a general counsel, let me just repeat, you need to understand the business model, you need to understand the technology, and you need to understand the dynamics of the pandemic. Pre-pandemic is gone. We need to understand, anticipate the post-pandemic dynamics, and be ready and be prepared for that. I would request Meera to add if she wants to add anything on this, or I would also invite Michael to add to any of the points on that I mentioned on M&A.
So Nitin, yes, you've rightly pointed out that the whole landscape now has changed, and the way we look at mergers and acquisitions has also changed. But more importantly, what I have seen in my last 24 years is that the whole, the importance given to a legal department within an organization has undergone a sea change. It is no more, it is they are your business partners. They are not a division that you go to when you are fighting a fire. You go to them proactively much earlier on. So definitely the role of legal manager, general counsel has become more central to the organization, and organization understands the value that legal counsels bring on the table. So yes, that's been a very important change, and going forward, I think we'll see a lot more of this. And to your point on mergers and acquisitions, it's very important to understand the strategic objective of why that merger or acquisition is being done, right? And it's at the same time, as a GC, you're also required to understand your business model, your strengths in the pharma industry. Where are you as a player? What are you trying to achieve? And technology has become the it's not no more an enabler. It's the platform that we are all using today to create that change, right? So I think it's very important for a GC to have a 360-degree view of the deal, the organization, what's being brought into the company, what's the end objective. And you're right, you can't skip any steps. There's always pressure to do, to get the deal out, to complete the deal. But as a watchdog of the organization, you have to ensure that you don't skip steps, you don't take unnecessary chances, because eventually those business folks may change, but tomorrow, you might have to go and deal with the after effects of something that you have not dealt with properly. So that's very, very critical. And when it comes to governance, I think two things. You have to be part of the core team. And at least we ensure in our companies, and we've seen it, that legal is part of the core team. They don't come into the picture only when you start to do a due diligence. You are in the part of the core team when you're structuring, when you're at the drawing board and you're trying to draw the deal. And I think that helps a lot. So very much, I feel things have changed for India, for the Indian in-house legal teams, definitely. Yeah.
Michael, you want to add it?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really valid point, and I really agree with Mira and you. So also in our company, the legal counsel, whatever grade and whatever activity you are handling, it's a part of really it's a business partner. So you are being approached in a very early stage to make sure that no surprises will be down to the road. So, and if in somebody's other, company is not the case, so they need to make sure or kind of sell this idea to be more involved and as on a strategic level, and not be we're not lawyers, right, and purely lawyer which wait to be approached. We need to be part of the process, and it's very important, especially in these times when to do M&A or divestments or whatever deals during current times, when you cannot visit the site. You wait for a long period from authorities to give answers.
Yes.
And you have no idea what market will bring. So it's very important to be on the early stage to oversee everything, all the changes, as you also rightfully mentioned before. Make sure everything is on the paper and then within the framework which can work, and not after that to solve the problems, because it's too late always.
Yeah, thank you, thanks Mira, and thanks Michael. Now we are really running very cut on the time, so we have just 10 minutes left, and we have still two sessions to cover. I would quickly ask Lex Witness team to pose the next poll so that we can listen to and see what audience have to say. The next question is, do you think the entire healthcare industry needs a much deserved robust legal framework for growth? So yes, 92, 82%, 79%, 80% says yes, they need a robust legal framework. So they want to pay lawyers more, they feel. Great. Fantastic. So 86% says that yes, the healthcare industry needs a robust legal framework for growth. 7% says no. 7%, another 7% says maybe. Thanks, Lex Witness team for this quick update on this. Now, friends, along with the last item, not last item, but along with in any M&A, what really goes is the due diligence. And unfortunately, with the COVID hitting us for almost now 15 months, the due diligence has become a virtual. Of course, earlier also due diligence had already almost become virtual due diligence. We had virtual data rooms. So the DD process has undergone a sea change in the modern day world. The reliance is on on-site visits, and physical meetings are reducing, while the VDRs are fast becoming the norm for conducting various aspects of DD in M&A. And as I said, the pandemic has made remote working more commonplace than we ever imagined. Virtual data rooms do raise some concerns around virtual sharing of sensitive data and issues, but with the passage of time, I guess data security systems are bound to become more robust and foolproof. So here is my take on the due diligence. I would think as a general counsel, and these are again friends, as I told you, this is not the really time where I can elaborately discuss on due diligence, but couple of key points from the general counsel's perspective. Let me mention this. First of all, it is not just the purchaser who does the due diligence. I would strongly recommend, and I am seeing a fundamental advantage of even doing vendors DD. Even if you are the seller, I would strongly recommend vendors also do the vendor DD, so you know what you are offering and you are not taken by surprise by the purchaser when their team finds out something wrong with you. That's number one. Secondly, whether you are for purchaser or for the seller or for the vendors, I would think customization of the list is very critical. Now, as I some time back I mentioned, most of the pharma deals are in terms of acquisition of acquisition of brands or acquisition of marketing rights or distribution network. So these are mostly intangible rights, but still. So and that's the reason why your data room list has to be very critical, very thoughtfully prepared, so that you really address the what exactly is the concern. Second most important thing I would recommend is that making all the consultants, and hear me very carefully when I'm saying this, and I'm talking with lot of responsibility here. I would suggest that as a general counsel, you must insist that all the consultants, whether it is financial, legal, technical, environmental, or reputational due diligence, so all the teams who are involved, you must brief them together. You must brief them together on the business objective. You must brief them together about what your perception or what your thought process is about the acquisition. What are your objectives? What you think, what the management thinks about the acquisition. Now that exchange of information to the consultant is very critical, and it must happen together. Second most important thing about due diligence I would recommend is that hold regular and short meetings. Don't wait for a long time to get past. Once the due diligence starts, insist on shorter meetings, shorter joint meetings with the consultants, get their inputs and integrate their inputs. I have seen in many cases lot of inputs from the financial due diligence and the legal due diligence, they cross. So it is very important to integrate the inputs, talk to the consultants, talk to the experts who are involved, and try to address or try to give them a way forward of what next. Another question which often is asked to us is detailed due diligence report versus an issue-based report. I would strongly recommend you must, if time permits, if the stakes are very high, I think you must insist on a detailed due diligence report, but nothing stops you from asking to submit a issue-based report also. And along with the issue-based report, I would strongly recommend you tell your advisors to make a risk matrix to evaluate the legal and financial risks. That is very critical for you. If you have a risk matrix about the legal risk involved or the financial risk involved on issues, it becomes very easy for the management to decide on the issue or to take a call on the issues. All in all, I would think due diligence exercise is a very serious exercise. And despite the whole talk on transparency and accountability, I think it is still we have to wait for a long time where we can expect companies to be completely transparent and sharing information to you. It is not just a problem of India. Even I have seen in overseas, lot of companies, they will give you information only when they are asked. So to expect companies to be upfront, transparent to you and offer everything to you, for asking, it's a distant dream. But still, advantage of online data is that lot of basic information today is available online, which can be accessed. But to sum up on the due diligence, and before I ask Meera and Michael and Sanjay to add on this, I would think due diligence is a very serious exercise. It must be taken with great serious efforts. Integrate all the issues and all the discussions that you get from the due diligence into your documentation. Many times I am seeing that integration doesn't happen. The lawyers who are doing the due diligence and the lawyers who are handling documentation are different teams. I don't know how much really they integrate, how much they really bring forward the issues, and how much they really participate. So you, as a general counsel of the company who are in charge of or responsible for the acquisition, I would think you have to be completely hands-on on all these efforts from all the consultants, and the key will be the issue-based report with you, along with the metrics, risk metrics that you get from the consultants. That insist on that, and it will make your life easy. I would invite Meera and Michael and also Sanjay to add if they want to add anything on the due diligence.
Yeah. From my perspective, what I see from the divestments, etc., virtual data room works perfectly. Right? Not perfectly, yeah, but it's very good. It's really accessible. It's very quick because people see sitting in their homes, they can access and see the information and review and everything. I think that the main kind of concern or need to be considered is really parties need to sit before and discuss how do we structure this data room, because sometimes I see, everything just pulled in without any kind of definitions, and then you have no, cannot find anything. So it should be, quality, legal, array, etc. So it's really structured, and then it's really useful, and I believe it's here to stay this way. I think in the future, after, if we'll have non-COVID times, it will be the same. We just will maybe meet at the end of the deal to celebrate the closing, and not beforehand. So yeah.
Meera, you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, so you made very relevant points, and we've noticed that in this pandemic situation where everything is virtual, first of all, that comfort is not there, because you're not you're not with the partner, you're not spending that much time, you're not going to their offices or their locations, especially when you have to do quality audits. It definitely is becoming a concern, and there are ways to do it. People are doing quality audits online. I think the most important thing is about sharing documentation, and that's where privacy and confidentiality both come into play, right? And it's very critical that while you see the information in data room, that you're not able to download it. So you have to be very careful about online. How are you doing the due diligence, and are you catching the right things, and can you get a download of all that information? We've had situations where people are not willing to share some of the stuff, so we ask for redacted versions and whether we can download. So confidentiality becomes key, privacy becomes key, because they're going to share a lot more information online, which would have otherwise been maybe shared offline by way of a physical copy, which you can then would have been able to destroy or something, ensure that you don't maintain a record of that. So yeah, these are concerns that are coming up, but there are ways and means to work around it. And to your point on due diligence, it's very critical that you like you earlier mentioned, that it's important to follow all possible steps. You need to look at and especially IP, and now we are seeing a lot more deals in pharma where there is a lot of IP involved, not just patents, but co-development work, IP which is foreground IP or background IP, and then there are a lot of players involved in the IP landscape. So yes, it is getting a little it's difficult. I mean, I wouldn't say it's difficult. I think you have to find innovative ways to work around it. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Thanks, Meera. Thanks, Michael. Sanjay, you want to add anything on due diligence?
Yeah, we while conducting a due diligence for any deal, so I would like to add something on the disclosure parts. So sometimes in the disclosure part, certain documents are not carefully examined. For example, a particular notice has been issued and there is no reply from the regulatory authorities. So it does not mean that the notice is closed. So that notice might come back after 4 years, like NPPA might come back after 4 years, an overcharging amount. So that will be a surprise for a acquirer company.
Absolutely.
That could be a completely contractual disputes, and it will run into the invoking the indemnity, and it will run into the thousands of $1 million dispute that can happen between the acquirer and the acquiree. So other than that, we must check some of the regulatory documents, which is in virtual due diligence. It's not possible unless you go to the regulatory office. Like if you are taking a license in marketing authorizations, or the marketing authorization can be transferred or not, that is a very important question in certain jurisdictions if you are going for a deal. So the products having a marketing authorization, if it is not transferred to the new company because of the regulatory restrictions, then the whole deal will become meaningless. So this there you need to visit personally physical, because you can't do the virtual due diligence in the government and regulatory offices. So these are the points I think is a bit challenging for the virtual due diligence.
Thanks, Sanjay. So 2 points, 2 audience have raised 2 very valid points. One is Sarashi has asked one question: how to quantify legal risk in a legal DD vis-a-vis impact on the transaction from both buyer and seller side? It's not very difficult, Sarashi. If it is a litigation, for example, you will know what the suit is for. So you will know the amount of the suit. If there, as Sanjay mentioned, if there is a penalty, the show cause notice, so you will know the amounts involved in those. So you will know what that liability is all about. Sometimes you are right. In some cases, for example, reputational damages, you will not be able to quantify. But again, if you ask business people, about the quantification of a reputational risk, they will be able in a position to quantify those reputational risks. Environmental, for example, environmental violation also sometimes becomes difficult to quantify. But again, if you talk to the experts in environment, they would probably be able to gauge and give you some kind of a quantification on that. Another question, Biplab has not a question, but he has made a point, and it's a very interesting point, which exactly Sanjay was talking. He's saying, I would like to add my bit to relation to M&A companies involved in M&A needs to ensure obtaining appropriate licenses and approvals before finalization of the transaction so that the business is not affected, and inventory management labeling. Now, I'll tell you a very live example here, and this is a practical solution what we adopted in one of the large M&A that I was working on. We were contemplating some approvals to be transferred, and we were not sure whether the government would approve those licenses or not. And they said, look, you get the government court order for merger and submit the court order, and we'll then transfer. And then I said, as Sanjay mentioned, it was important for us to go and meet the regulator. So I went and met the regulator, and I told them, look, sir, it will be a very difficult situation if post the court order, if you don't permit or if you raise some issues, because these are very critical licenses for us. And the via media, what we came out was the regulator, for confidentiality, I can't mention the regulator's name, but the regulator told us that, why don't you write us a letter saying that we have submitted a transfer of our business or merger of our business to another company, which is pending sanction from the High Court. Pending that, can you give us in principle approval? So we got an in principle approval from the regulator saying that subject to the High Court sanctioning the scheme, we have no in principle difficulty in giving the license. So we had already procured an in principle approval, which was not there in the system, which was not there in the regulations. So we created a sort of a practical approach there, and the regulator was very kind. He said, yeah, of course, I have no difficulty in saying that in principle, I am approving this transfer of license, and subject to sanction from the court, we'll give a final approval. So we got the final approval once the scheme was sanctioned. So these are some of the practical aspects we could look at. There's one more question. As I understand, Indian government is planning to allow foreign legal practitioners to practice in India. I don't think so. That's not the correct my information. So friends, we have just crossed 6:10. We have one more poll question, if at all we want to take, but otherwise
I think we have some questions from Hetero Sudarshan. He is asking for something.
Yeah, question of the panel: how privacy laws, especially Disha bill, will accelerate digital compliance and bringing down cost in healthcare? Sudarshan Pralap. Who would like to take? Meera, you would like to take the answer question, or Sanjay would like to take?
Yeah, so see, the Disha bill is with regard to storing health information and more relevant to companies who are doing clinical trials or have storing clinical trial data. Again, with the new privacy bill, which is again in the offing and likely to come up in the winter session, there are some changes Indian companies will have to undergo, both in terms of technology and in terms of policies and procedures about sharing and storing and destroying, your privacy, your data, your sensitive data, as well as your personally identifiable data. So it's just a matter of time. It is going to come. But that question on Disha is more relevant to if you are into clinical trials, if you have information about health information about your employees or about or you're in the business where you store that data, then it is more relevant. And technology will help. Initially, there is a cost to technology, but in the long run, the return on investment in technology is very high. So it will definitely help the organizations versus keeping manual records today. That's my view. Yeah.
Great. So before I conclude, really, there's one more item subtopic which I must complete. We are just 10 minutes late, so there is no harm in completing that last point. I would invite the speakers, Meera, Sanjay, whoever wants to comment upon how do we tackle the global vaccines import race. What are your takes on that, or what is your perspective on that, Sanjay?
See, we have seen the vaccine development recently in last 2 years, which involves the public money and private money, and fast approvals, and especially emergency authorizations across the world. There are more than 100 vaccines are under development, and a couple of them have been given emergency authorizations. But however, the marketing authorization has not been given any of them. And as the demand is very high, every company is trying to develop and market the vaccine at the phase 2. And the development of the vaccine or the drug takes number of years. It requires from preclinical to clinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And there is no guarantee that the drug will work. So in this case, having a, because in the interest of the public health, government and regulators have allowed them to use the vaccines at the clinical trial stage itself, at the phase 2. So, but however, it creates a lot of risk also in terms of supply, distributions, corruptions in the distribution channels, falsification of the vaccines, and of course, to some extent, efficacy, storage, and of course, some trade barriers. So many developing countries have the capacity to manufacture the vaccines, but however, this intellectual property barriers stops them to manufacturing the vaccine within the country, or there is a limited transfer of technology. In India, we see that DCGI has come out with a quick response in order to address this COVID-19 situations. It has come out with the change in the clinical trial rules 2019, as well as it has given relaxations if the vaccines has been approved by US FDA, PMDA, Japan, EU, and WHO. So the preclinical data is they can rely on the preclinical data and then go for a straight away the clinical trials. Further, DCGI has given another I would say relaxations, that if the vaccine has been approved outside India, so private sector can import the vaccines in association with the importer and who is an agent of the manufacturer. So these are the relaxations, and further the product which is imported, that need not be required to send for test and analysis at CDL Kasoli if the drug has vaccine has been released by the country's approved lab. So these are the relaxations what I see the DCGI has come to meet the to address the COVID-19 issues. But I would welcome other panelists to talk about this. This is very important, and everybody would like to hear about this vaccine.
Your view?
So Nitin, yeah, I concur with what Sanjay is saying. We've seen a lot of activity around the COVID vaccines, right? And it's a like you mentioned earlier, it's a play of both politics as well as the regulatory framework, as well as getting the right drug across to our population and our patients. So yes, the aim by the regulators is to ensure that we get faster regulatory approvals, and of course they have put in a fast track process that Sanjay just talked about, which has helped helped us import vaccines faster. And the IP issue is going to be a concerning issue, as you know. It's not going to get resolved only at an India level. It's a
global issue.
It's a global issue. It will involve the TRIPS agreement, and all of that will get looked into. So yes, I think Sanjay's mostly covered most of the points. Yeah.
So just to conclude, I would request. First of all, I must thank Michael coming all the way, joining from Germany. Meera, thanks a lot for joining us. Sanjay, thank you. But before I conclude, I would think that the role of the General Counsel in pharma companies, particularly on two fronts, are going to be position of opportunity and also position of challenge. Challenge in terms of regulations and evolving changes to the global market, and opportunities. I would think that the next 4 or 5 years at least, the M&A market is going to be really buzzing with the pharma companies doing a lot of deals. So the general counsels are going to be really very busy. Their role is going to be extremely important in the growth strategy of the companies. So I hope that today's discussion would help all the audience in addressing some of those issues. But still, but to conclude, Michael, I would request in all the panelists to just give the last comment on what the role General Counsel really should really look forward. Michael?
Yeah, I believe, as I said previously, it's less to be lawyer, but more to be risk manager, to juggle between the different risks, understand the business, as you also previously mentioned, and then that's the role, to be risk manager, less purely lawyer.
Meera?
Yeah, so I'll just add to Michael's points that yes, you have to be a business partner. You need to know the business. You need to know the regulatory environment very clearly. You need to be able to understand, identify risks, but you also need to give solutions to mitigate those risks to be able to move forward, right? And it's a balancing act. Sometimes the decision necessarily does not lie at the table of the legal counsel. It may lie at the desk of maybe the commercial people or a group of the top leadership team that can take the decision. Yes, but what is very critical is from the role of the general counsel has evolved, will evolve. They will play a far more significant role, and the general counsel will be part of that leadership team or that room that takes the decision. I think that is a key change that we are
Absolutely, absolutely. Sanjay?
Yeah, I mean, what they have said, I agree with that, because a role of a general counsel is of a business partner guardian. I would like to add guardian, because ultimately the managing director and director are responsible for any act or omission of the organization. So therefore, proactive approach to business solutions, understanding the business model, giving ideas to the business becomes more happy. And but at the same time, a role of a guardian should not be lost. So classify the risk always: high risk, low risk, moderate risk. So see that high risk can always will have to say no, and moderate risk you have to evaluate, and only the low risk you can recommend for the business call. Because in the high risk, if there is an imprisonment, how somebody can take a decision on that? If you violate this, so there is if you don't have a license, you're going to sell, so completely you're going to face the jail. So this is how you can classify the risk.
No, this could be one of the good metrics report, I would say, from the due diligence perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much once again to the really brilliant audience. We have got Dr. Pushpalata saying thanks everyone. Event was too good. All speakers are very good. And then we have Biplab saying thank you, Nitin, thank you, Sanjay, thank you, Meera, thank you, Michael, for the wonderful session. So great to see not only the speakers working so hard to make this session successful, but also to see the audience who really get involved, get engaged. And last but not the least, I must really thank Akshay Alag from Lex Witness and the entire team of Lex Witness for putting down this fantastic session, technically making it so sound and seamless. We have just crossed, I think, 15 minutes extra we have taken, but I think that's really still worth. Thank you, Lex Witness team, for putting this together. And thank you all the audience. Thank you the speakers. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Time, let's have more time, Nitin.
Yeah, next time we will have more time, so that there will be more takeaways.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meera. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Nitin sir.
Thank you.
Seeking your permission
Thank
to
you,
end the
Michael.
webinar now.
I'm sorry?
Thank you.
Seeking your permission to end the webinar, sir.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.